Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Windows on the World for a Saturday rather than a Friday. We've been doing quite a lot of streams on a Friday. I can take them off now. We've been doing quite a lot of streams on the Friday, bringing them back, mainly about restoring our rights. But one of the things that we've been consistent about in our shows is looking at the influence of negative entities. Now, whether this is a corporate entity or a demonic entity, there's very little difference in the actual effects. We're in psychological warfare at the moment, and our overlords are basically technocrats. The silicone tech demons is really what we're up against, and they have announced that lockdowns could go on for another 12 months. Now, it's clear that the pandemic narrative is just a narrative. It is merely a smokescreen, because the induced gaslighting of the public to keep them under control while a global health security system is put in place is what has been going on since last March. So for them to say we're going to be in lockdown for another 12 months, well, how would they know that? Because if it's a pandemic, then that's got to be reviewed every 28 days. But the legislation they've brought in actually makes it possible for this to happen. That's the Coronavirus Act of 2020. So the mind virus is being induced through consistent negative programming and fear. And that's also the subject of tonight's show. The public are being bombarded now with fear-inducing negative propaganda, especially in the UK, because the UK is being made an example of. It's going to be brought down first. This was clearly stated in the early 90s. And even before that, let's go back to Our Common Future, where it was also the subject of sustainable development. Sustainable development came out of the document known as Our Common Future. And it was brought into the Rio Conference of 92. What's all that got to do with what's going on? Because COVID-19 is a driver of global governance, a bit like climate change is a driver of global governance. And we've been discussing this on our shows. We've been talking about the nature of pandemics. We've been talking about the nature of what is really going on. The world population, though, are being controlled. They're being controlled through a mind virus, a virus of the mind. And basically, this is all about black propaganda. The Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group, have you heard of them? They instruct the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, and they say that the activity of the public is allowing the virus to spread. So the mind virus is very real. They, though, like all demonic entities, want more and more control and more power. Their instructions make no sense. None of this makes any sense. They say in order to achieve what was previously achieved back in March, we need to get stricter. Nothing was previously achieved back in March apart from the destruction of all inalienable rights and now the end of all rights. If the victims comply, well, basically, that is up to them. It's about consent. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight is consent and implied consent. But demonic corporate bodies are made up of sold out and possessed drones, and they do not deal in truth or facts. And that's what we're in, the post-truth world, and how the public are being made to behave through fear, which is not consent. So the World Bank and its minions are rolling out a global system to control and manage all using this pandemic narrative to keep the public scared, compliant and distracted. They even offer a glimmer of hope, then snatch it away at the last minute, just like they did over Christmas. And at the last minute, they further demoralize the population, gaining even more power through submission, despair, and defeat, just like demons do. The mind virus is the work of demonic entities. Our previous shows, I've got a few notes here because I want to keep it quite tight. Our previous shows on the presence of other worlds have featured Jerry Marzinski, our guest tonight, George Degartic, and also Sherri Swiney. And we've been discussing this for the last couple of years, the influence of negative entities and what we can do about it. Negative thoughts, negative voices, where do thoughts come from? Where do our thoughts come from? With learning and awareness, it can be deduced that consistently negative voices and thoughts come to us. Where do they come from? Extreme negative thoughts and impulses are an intrusion into your awareness, into your energetic field. This can happen with differing degrees. Negative thoughts, interferences, things that interfere with your energy field. We've all had this, but it's on different levels. Negative entities which sort of temporarily take over the true essence of their victim, onto the extreme end, which is kind of all-out demonic possession, which has been talked about for thousands of years. In the Nag Hammadi scriptures, which were found in Upper Nile, Egypt, around 1945, they were basically a selection of 13 codices, leather-bound, and they talk about the interference through archons, which just means leaders, really, or magistrates, people who are in charge. In a way, that's a bit like the technocrats of today. They are the archons of the old world. The negative impulses, voices, and even putting demonic energy into the energetic field. Now, this may sound a bit esoteric until you actually think about it as a psychological operation. We're in a massive psychological operation, especially in the UK. We are being made to be compliant. The current gaslighting and constant fear-inducing narratives, basically it's psychological warfare. The real virus unleashed by the negative rulers and their global action plan is actually a virus of the mind. Yes, the Nag Hammadi scriptures state that the rulers have always known this. There is no difference. They say the rulers fight against the inner person, which is your essence. So basically, the whole idea of a communitarian system is to make you part of a hive mind so you don't have any individual thoughts. Therefore, you will be opened up to groupthink, which is, in a way, intrusion. And that's what we're talking about here. Anything that intrudes in your energy field and without your consent is basically negative or demonic energy. The Nag Hammadi's scriptures sort of reiterate this. There's a psychological war for the control of minds to create the global mind virus, which will bring about compliance through fear to force consent into the dystopia that we're going into at the moment. Now, this will only work in favor of the technocratic tyrants who are imposing it. See our previous shows. We've done loads of them on this. They themselves, though, are soulless automatons. We talked about that in our last show. When we talk about people who are running, say, the World Economic Forum, these people do not think in an organic way. They think in an artificial intelligence way. So those of us who can think organically can usurp the narrative. The negative voices attacked through the TV and the media. The media is gaslighting the public to an extent that's never been known before. Now, before I introduce Jerry Marzinski, jerrymarzinski.com was a psychiatric practitioner for 35 years, was Jerry. And he's been on many shows, and we've had the most fascinating conversations on this subject that I've ever had, because very few people in the psychiatric profession will touch this subject. Let's just go through some patterns of what negative voices actually do. Now, we can run the whole gamut here of those thoughts that come into your head, those thoughts which are extraordinarily negative, and you think, where did that come from? Well, it didn't come from your true essence. It interrupted your energy field. This seems to be the way it works. But if you open yourself up through trauma, abuse, drugs, or alcohol, then negative entities can actually jump in and take over. And that's called possession. And that's very serious. And that takes an awful lot of effort to remove those sort of entities. But that's at the extreme end. But if we look around us, we see most people are having more and more intrusions of negative entities, which is why I'm doing this show tonight. But Jerry has got some notes here, which I'll just bring in before we get on to talking to Jerry. The voices consistently battle for increasing control over the individual's mind and action. In other words, once these voices or entities take hold, they want more and more power over the individual until they actually possess the individual, and they can drive the individual to incredibly negative acts, which are detrimental to the individual and all those around them. These negative entities seem to feed off fear and trauma. Have a think about that, and have a think about what brought fear and trauma into your life, and try and make some sense of that statement, because it's incredibly important, and it's something that I learned an awful lot from. They will consistently and constantly maneuver to snag their victim's attention, insert negative thoughts into the thought stream. Voices are consistently negative, derogatory, insulting, abusive, and destructive. They fake positivity, and they can fake being helpful, but invariably turn on their victim once they gain the victim's trust, which is exactly what the government in the UK and their psychological steering teams are doing to the public. There's no difference. The voices consistently work towards the creation of a prolonged negative emotional state in their victim, including anger, paranoia, anxiety, guilt, shame, and drive their victim to generate every negative emotion possible. Now, isn't this interesting? Because that's exactly what BBC News does all day long. And they also coerce you into this idea of community. In other words, if you're not joining in, then you're in the wrong. It's called communitarianism. I had to get that in. The voices consistently oppose religion. This is interesting. They become noticeably disturbed if their victim repeats the 23rd Psalm, the Lord's Prayer, or songs like Amazing Grace. This is what Jerry's found in his extensive research and experience over the years. They actively oppose the reading of the Bible. Why would a hallucination, this is what the states say these things are, this is what the psychiatric profession say these things are, why would a hallucination consistently oppose religion? The individual's energetic state noticeably decreases after a severe attack by the voices. If the voices are present constantly, the victim will remain in a low energetic state, which means a vulnerable state, and a worn out state, a state where the victim cannot recover. Many have reported they can feel their energy being drained when the voices show up. The voices consistently get louder and more prolonged after sunset. This is quite a phenomenon, because I've known people who've gone into extreme trauma and had extremely destructive thoughts, including self-harm, all sorts of really violent, self-destructive actions take place often after 3 a.m. in the morning. And this seems to be quite consistent. The voices block or divert any effort the individual makes towards positive spiritual growth of any kind. That is really important. Now, isn't that what the media is doing to us at the moment? That's exactly what they're doing. The voices consistently advise their victims to behave in ways that will increase their turmoil and suffering, because these negative entities are feeding off their suffering. The trauma, this is energy harvesting, which is exactly what's going on globally at the moment. The voices constantly work towards increasing the control they have over their victim, constantly maneuvering for a myriad of ways they commonly utilize to command the attention of their victim. So it gets harder and harder to ignore them. The voices are capable of gaslighting their victim. The voices are capable of accessing virtually every negative event in the individual's memory. They have absolute insight and control over everything that you think. This is really fascinating. They know everything about you, and they will constantly attack anything positive about you and really accentuate anything negative, to the point where you feel you are absolutely worthless, which is where you are completely vulnerable to their control, of course. The voices do not want their victim to speak to others about them, and will do everything in their power to have their victim isolate themselves for any who care about them or are willing to help them. Now, this I find quite interesting, because conversely, if you are completely aware of your energy field, you often want to be completely alone, because nothing can get in. This takes us back to what we were talking about with these Nag Hammadi scriptures. I found this was a constant theme, that there was a unified effort to keep out negative entities. And if you are not vigilant to start with, then they can get in. But once the awareness takes over and you have awareness of what's around you and your own energy field, you will be more aware of when these entities are trying to get in. Of course, through drugs, that opens it up straight away because your awareness is gone. Through abuse, it devastates you. It cuts basically right into you. I know a lot of people who've had abuse and trauma in the past, and often it's a wound which cannot be healed. Therefore, those people have to be extra vigilant because that wound will not close. Now, this all may sound abstract, but people who've experienced this will know what I'm talking about. The voices will use against their victims any deceptive and upsetting lie and manipulate their perception in a way to generate negative emotional energy. Exactly what is happening through the media. Once again, the voices get louder if they are ignored. And psychiatrists consistently tell their patients to just ignore the voices. The voices will steer the individual away from anything that makes them feel good, with the exception of anything that would addict them. So the voices will tell you to get more addicted and lose more control, basically, of your own awareness. They can negatively influence your feelings without saying anything, which results in the generation of negative thinking. So remember, negative entities have access to your complete memory bank. And that is something that's going to come up in this show, something I've helped someone with quite recently. And I've spoken to Sherri about this, and I think it averted a suicide. I can't be certain of that, but the person on the end of the phone was going to kill themselves. And I went through a simple process, which Sherri, who we're going to be speaking to tonight, kind of pioneered. And Sherri will talk about also. And we're going to get into that. We have mentioned it in the previous shows, but we're going to give a big update tonight because our special guest, George, has some news for us. But let's just finish this off. The voices short-circuit reason by urging a knee-jerk negative emotional reaction to stressors, often damaging to relationships. They will damage the relationships around you. If the victim allows themselves to become bored or basically empty, there's a great line in the Nag Hammadi scriptures, I think it's in the book of James, where it says, "Fill yourself, for those who are coming will invade you." I'm paraphrasing here, but that's what they're saying. So if you haven't got that awareness and you're not full with your own self, I'm not talking about egotism here, I'm talking about your own awareness, your own energy field, and being aware of it, then other things will try and fill it for you, which is exactly what the media does to at the moment, right? The voices disguise themselves as their victims' thoughts, making it difficult to identify them as the enemy. The intent of the voices is different from the intent of their victims. The voices make their victims forget or use or take for granted the tools designed to oppose and weaken them, diverting their victim into other activities to distract them from any opposition. So yes, these are just some of the points that Sherri has brought up. The voices will consistently attempt to convince their victims that they are stupid, ugly, worthless, unlovable, a burden to others, and everyone would be better off if they were not around, which is exactly the idea of the Global Action Plan. That is Agenda 2030 in a nutshell. Get off the planet. You're polluting it too much. So basically, we're talking about demonic gaslighting. And that demonic gaslighting is happening to us through the media, which is why this show tonight is going to be so important. The voices will constantly attempt to pull their victim away from consensual reality and pull the victim into their negative, hellish world. Now, this is something I've experienced around people who've been disturbed by entities, is that they will get you into trouble. They will bring trouble upon you to drag you into this world. And it's a horrible feeling when you know that this is going to happen and there's nothing you can do to help the victim at the particular time. And I've been through that as well. So, okay, without further ado, I will introduce Sherri. But first, I'll just give you the definition of hallucinations. Just is right at the end here. A sensory experience of something that does not exist outside the mind, caused by various physical and mental disorders or by reaction to certain toxic substances, and usually manifested as visual or auditory images. Now, what we're talking about tonight are not hallucinations. So that's just something to think about. I'm going to now introduce Sherri. Okay, Sherri. There you go.
Hey.
Bit of a long introduction, but I think a necessary one.
Well, yeah. What Mark just read you is a list of patterns that the schizophrenic voices run, and this comes from years and years of working with schizophrenic patients. It comes from Sherri and George are in the background here. We'll have them on in just a second. But every single one of these is a pattern that these voices run. Now, psychiatry, the psychiatric mafia, is intent on making us believe that the voices that schizophrenics hear are hallucinations. However, if they run consistent, predictable patterns, then they're not hallucinations. They're something else. What controls them, what holds them onto these patterns? There's something that holds them onto these patterns. And we've defined what, 23 of them, something like that. And there's more out there. They can't be hallucinations if they're patterns. But the psychiatric mafia is intent on making you believe that the voices which drive schizophrenia, which is one of the top 10 illnesses on the planet, they don't know what causes it. So they make things up. They're intent on keeping people convinced that there's some kind of physiological, biological cause that their medications treat, but they haven't been able to find one. They haven't found the schizophrenia germ. They haven't found the schizophrenia gene. They haven't found anything. They haven't found any proof of a chemical imbalance because there is none. So what they're doing is treating millions of people, at least here in the US, with these toxic neuroleptic drugs that they've come up with that are extremely expensive and some of the most dangerous drugs in the medical profession. So what I want to do is kind of dip into, before I introduce Sherri and George, who have had firsthand experiences with these voices. And, by the time you get off this broadcast, hopefully you'll be convinced that these voices are not hallucinations. There's something that keeps them on this track. So I probably ought to tell you a little bit about me. I spent my first 7 years of my career working in the biggest psychiatric hospital on the planet. When I got there, I think there were close to 10,000 patients there. It sprawled over 200 acres. And there was every mental illness on the planet in there. I was an adrenaline junkie, so I found that interesting. And I started talking to schizophrenics. And when I first got there, it was like I believed, school taught me that the voices were hallucinations. All the books said they're hallucinations. All the professors said they're hallucinations. 4 years of undergraduate school and 4 years of graduate school, the voices are hallucinations. I mean, so by the time you get out of the formal academic training and get a BA, master's degree, PhD, or psychiatry degree, you're convinced that the voices are hallucinations. I mean, that's what they told you. Why would they lie to you? But in fact, they have. They have no proof they're hallucinations. They only, what do they say? Declared it. They hereby declare that the voices are hallucinations with no research, no background. They don't even ask these people about the voices they're hearing. For the most part, and I'd say this is probably 98% of the cases, when a psychiatrist hears that a patient is hearing voices, they go, well, ignore them. They're hallucinations. Your brain is broken. You got a chemical imbalance. You're forever flawed. You're a defective individual. Here, take these toxic drugs and, go away. And those things are extremely expensive. So what I want to do is get into here briefly before introducing George and Sherri. a little bit of the background and the history of the psychiatric mafia, who given their way of doing things, they would drug everybody senseless. I mean, you can't virtually walk into a psychiatrist's office and not come out of there with some kind of drug. It's kind of like, well, you don't have any responsibility for your feelings or your mental health. We'll handle that. You just come over in here. We'll handle it quick. You take this drug, blah, 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 and pay us $1 million and you're out. So let me regress back to the 1800s. Back in the 1800s, there was a raging battle between psychiatry and neurology. Psychiatry was the stepchild. Neurology was making scientific progress. Psychiatry was in a battle with the psychoanalysts, and the psychoanalysts were expensive, and at least they were talking to people. Psychiatry was like the secondhand stepchild of the medical industry. There was no germ they were treating. They didn't know what they were dealing with. So the way they treated mental illness was all these torturous things. And if you read our book, you'll see a history of the torturous things they did to schizophrenics and the mentally ill, experimenting with them, shocking their brains, poisoning them with insulin, putting them in insulin shock, freezing cold baths, douches with grapefruit juice, and all. I mean, it was just horrendous what they did to these people. So in 1891, all they had really back then was chains and straitjackets, which were invented in France to control this population. So these people started being sent to hospitals. Then the one I worked in was probably more humanitarian back when it first opened, back before the Civil War, than any since then. So from going from that hospital, I entered a PhD program, and from there moved down to Arizona, where I went to work for a county hospital doing psychiatric crisis. From there, I went to work in a mental health center, the biggest mental health center in Arizona. Then moved to the state prison and the psychology department, working with the criminally insane and prisoners of all kinds. I spent somewhere around 17, 18 years there. And it was there where I could really get to experimenting and asking these patients questions. In the state hospital, it was like if you upset one of the patients, everybody wants to know, well, what'd you do? What'd you say to him? What happened? It was like the unwritten rule is you do not upset psychotic patients, because basically you never know what they're going to do, and psychiatrists were always getting beat up by them. Not everybody else, attendants, but mostly psychiatrists, and we'll get into that later. So if I tried to ask the schizophrenics at the state hospital questions about their voices and they got upset, it was like a red light. I mean, it's like, you better watch out. You're upsetting these guys. That's something that should never be done. Twice, psychiatrists at the state hospital found out I was asking patients about their voices. I was pulled up before them onto the red carpet and told that the voices were hallucinations, that what I was doing by asking schizophrenics questions about what the voices were saying, because nobody else was. They said I was making them worse by reinforcing their hallucinations. But by then, I strongly suspected they weren't hallucinations. So here they were trying to suppress me from asking these people about the number one primary symptom of paranoid schizophrenia, the voices they hear. They don't ask them what the voices say. The only time they pay attention to it is if the schizophrenic says, hey, I'm thinking about suicide. Then all of a sudden the voices become real. I mean, they jump like they're stuck with a hot poker. They throw them on suicide watch, fill them full of drugs because they don't want a suicide on their watch. So it was at the prison where I surrounded myself with criminally insane patients who were schizophrenic, who we had an agreement that they would tell me what their voices said in real time. So it was the first time I really got into the world of schizophrenics, and it got very, very strange. You think the phenomena just stays in their head, but it doesn't. And it got very scary at times, very scary, especially working with criminally insane. It was like walking on a razor blade. I had an agreement with them that I'd help them out all I could, and gave them access to my office if they were running into trouble. The exchange was they had to tell me about their voices in real time. And sometimes they'd say stuff like, yeah, the voices are telling me to kill guard Joe Blow because he disrespected me in front of other people. So things like got a little hairy. It was like walking a razor blade at times. So it took a while to learn how to talk to them. But once I did, these patterns that we're talking about started emerging. And I'm thinking like, okay, what holds them to that? At the same time, I'm watching psychiatrists insisting that the voices are caused by a chemical brain imbalance in the patient's head, but never giving them any kind of test, any kind of lab work, any kind of anything to determine what is out of balance and by how much, ever. And then I found out after questioning them that they don't have any such test to measure. They don't even know what the chemical imbalance of the brain should be. And here they are pushing this chemical imbalance fraud. So let me go into the history of the people who were doing this. Back in the early 1800s, there was a battle, like I was saying, between psychiatry and neurology. Psychiatry was losing badly. Neurology was a real science, and psychiatry just couldn't get a grip on anything. In 1891, phenothiazine, a derivative of a dye that was found in a European dye lab. It was found by accident. They found that it could work as an antihistamine, as an anesthetic in surgery. And later on, they found that it was really useful in dumbing down entire psychiatric populations so staff didn't have to fight with the mentally ill or try to stuff them into a straitjacket. So here they had a means of controlling these people. Other than their barbaric treatments they had been using, which were emetics, with things that made these mentally ill people sick. So emetics, they'd make them nauseous. They'd get sick and they'd throw up. And you know how you feel after you throw up. You don't feel like doing anything. You're just sick. They were using insulin shock. They found that if they pumped these poor people full of insulin to the point where they went into shock, they were worn out and they didn't have any energy to listen to their voices and cause trouble. They went to ETC, which is electroshock therapy. So they put electrodes on the side of the person's brain and then run, high voltage or low amperage, high voltage through the person's brain, and it would wipe them out. I mean, it's like stunned. It stunned them for days, and they shut up. They didn't cause any problems. And it was more the attendants in the psych hospital that had control over that. They'd go to the psychiatrist and go, hey, Johnny B over here is causing me a lot of trouble. I think it's time for another shock treatment for him, and they'd be put on the list. The worst of what they did is in Europe. I think it was. I'm not sure if it was Germany or not, but they in a lab they had a angry monkey, a hysterical monkey that was violent. And what he would do is he'd throw feces out of the cage at everybody. So what they did is they got him and they pithed its brain. They went in with a nice pick kind of thing through the corner of his eyeball, jammed it up into his prefrontal cortex up here, and scrambled his brain. And when they'd done that, they found out they had a virtual zombie on their hands that they could do anything they wanted with, and that worked out fine for him. So that started going big time here in the U.S., and we write about it in our book. They even had a lobotomy mobile that would travel the country and do these lobotomies. And I saw one patient at the state hospital that had one, and my initial thought after talking to him was he's not quite human, and I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something bad wrong, And they did this to thousands and thousands of patients with their lobotomy mobile traveling around the United States, scrambling their brain. Here you go, psychiatry in action. Basically control and power again. So this went on until 1910 when the Rockefellers came in, and they go, hey, these psychiatric drugs are taken off. We have to take control of these and the medical drugs. So what they did is they bought off Congress. In 1910, the Rockefellers and the Carnegie Foundation pushed through the infamous Flexner Report, which basically shut down licensing of all medical schools other than those teaching pharmacology. All the others were called quacks. All the other therapies that existed at that time, the Tesla violet ray, electric therapies, naturopathies, all these other different kinds of natural therapies that were developing around that time were immediately shut down, made illegal, and the only legal doctors were those who attended medical schools who taught pharmacology. All the rest of them were outlawed. They couldn't produce licensed doctors. Thanks to the Rockefellers and the Carnegie Foundation, and again, another payoff to Congress. They pushed this bill through Congress and it became law. That wasn't for the public interest at all. So they kept working on these phenothiazines, and by 1951, they were in fairly common use. They were used to drug down entire psychiatric populations, and anybody who came into a psychiatrist was given these things. You complain of voices, you're given basically a chemical lobotomy. So for over 10 years, when they when they started using this drug, they had no idea what it did or how it worked. So as things progressed, they started blaming schizophrenia, the cause of schizophrenia, for everything under the sun. First, it was the mothers, then it was genetics, then it was food. One thing after another, and recently they settled, oh well, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain of these patients. They're chemically deformed, their brains are broken, they're less than humans. Here, take these drugs and get out of our face. So they're making like 3.7 or 4.7 billion dollars a year right now, just selling antipsychotic drugs, which for the most part are major tranquilizers, except for some of these atypicals that, from the patients I talk to, don't work at all. So here's millions of people all around, many millions of people all around the world taking these antipsychotic drugs. And what they found is, upon autopsies of these patients, they found their minds, their heads, not their heads, but their brains had shrunk, noticeably shrunk. And this occurred time after time after time. So they published a paper on it, and the psychiatric mafia and the big pharma come up and go, oh no, it's not the drugs, it's the schizophrenia. The schizophrenia is doing this. The schizophrenia is shrinking their brains. It's this disease that's doing it. So they some of these more honest researchers got some monkeys, and they fed some of them, a placebo, and they gave the rest these antipsychotic neuroleptic drugs. They found out that consistently the monkeys' brains had shrunken also. And this is what they're giving to millions and millions of people all over the world right now. It rots out your peripheral nervous system. It shrinks your brain. It causes permanent physiological damage, and only should be used by patients who can't in any other way control themselves, or have to be controlled. And if it is used, it should be used temporarily until something else can be put into place. So what they did is they denied all this stuff. They continued pushing in their advertisements. This is due to a chemical brain imbalance, and our drugs fix that or temporarily balance things. So in 1996, they weren't curing anything. These drugs didn't cure anything. For the most part, at least the earlier ones, when I was around, they sedated. There were major tranquilizers. They weakened the voices and they calmed the person down. Right? So they did work in that way. So here comes the psychiatric mafia had taken over, and Big Pharma had taken over the National Institute of Mental Health by this time. It was driven by Big Pharma. By 1996, it was driven by Big Pharma. And it's well on its way toward the wholesale conversion of biological and genetic theories for the cause of schizophrenia and all mental disorders. Because they had to be biological to have a drug that would affect them. So they had to keep convincing the population that there was some kind of biological cause, which they have not found. They haven't ever found, and they never will found, because they can't conceive of a illness that has no physical cause and no physical cure, like schizophrenia. So basically, they had no cure. They didn't know what caused it, and they were drugging these people down in by the millions. So starting in 1952, they had the Dictionary of Mental Disabilities, or DSM-1. In 1952, it had 106 psychiatric diagnoses. By 1998, it had 256 psychiatric diagnoses. By today, DSM-5, 297 psychiatric diagnoses. Now, you might think these diagnoses came from research. I mean, somebody's in a lab, somebody's proven things. I mean, here's hardcore anything. No, these are all made up. Every single one of them is made up. They don't have a test for any of them. There is no lab work. There is no EKG, the EEG. There is nothing. They have no biological test. There is no germ. This is not a biological thing. But in order to make money, they got to keep pushing it as a biological thing. And what happened here is they kept fabricating these mental diagnoses, and then Big Pharma would come up behind the psychiatric mafia and say, "Oh, okay, well, we'll make a medicine for this," and they go out and they sell it, and you look at your TV, and here comes all these commercials. Yeah, if you have this thing, we have a medicine for it. Look at this. Ask your doctor. And 6 months later, they're all being sued. So right now, 1 out of every 6 Americans is on some kind of psychiatric drug. And what the medical establishment is doing, especially the psychiatric mafia, is you're incompetent to deal with your own feelings. You're incompetent to deal with your own spirituality. We got to do it for you. Here, come at us and get these pills. Now these doctors, these pills are some of the most dangerous out there in the medicine is using. So this quote comes from Dr. Peter Brigham from his book Toxic Psychiatry. Now, he was one of the bigwigs in NIMH, but he would call him a psychiatric whistleblower. I mean, he just comes clean with how dirty this whole discipline is. So he says, if you believe you must take neuroleptic drugs, be alert for any danger signals that your body isn't responding normally. Almost any organ can be adversely affected by the neuroleptics: eyes, nose, ears, throat, internal organs such as the liver, stomach, intestines, cardiovascular system, and sexual organs, the skin, and of course the brain. A small percentage of patients suffer disastrous consequences such as neuroleptic malignant syndrome, sudden unexplained death, cardiovascular crises, seizures, heat stroke, and overheated institutions. And then he goes on to say, these are among the most dangerous medications ever used in medicine. Now, do you think psychiatrists tell people what the side effects are? I haven't seen it. And I've been out there for 35 or more years. Very seldom will they tell the patient what to watch out for, what the side effects are. And the people who take these drugs, the schizophrenics, they're not going to look at the labels and read all the side effects. But if they did, they would see a horrendous long list of them. All right. So, they're established with these drugs. They're not looking for a cure. They don't make any money on a cure. Since 1980, the standard estimate of how many schizophrenics were in the United States was 2.8 million. When the National Institute of Mental Health was criticized for not spending enough money on schizophrenic research, they manipulated their statistics in their report. and dropped the number of schizophrenics in the US from 2.8 million to 750,000. Right. So NIMH is another pawn of big pharma and the psychiatric mafia. So they manipulated the statistics. So it went from like spending $19 per patient to like now all of a sudden they're spending with, when they drop the numbers like that, now they're spending like $35 a patient, and they're out of the woods as far as criticism. So their meds don't cure anything. There is no chemical imbalance. They haven't ever found one. It's been disproved. There's a lot of research papers showing that it has, but they're still pushing a chemical imbalance in their advertisements for these drugs. And they're manipulating whatever research comes out. Any research that comes out that says there's no chemical imbalance, no gene, those aren't published. Those are shot down, or they're manipulated, or they're changed somehow. Big pharma's drugs don't cure anything. They merely suppress these symptoms. They're dishing out chemical lobotomies to these people. And some of them have said, after coming off these drugs, I mean, these things damage your brain with long-term use. I had one fella said, I have like this vacancy in there. Something's gone. So these antipsychotic drugs are chemical lobotomies. It's like, okay, we'll relieve you of the burden of consciousness. Here, pay us hundreds of dollars for these pills. And matter of fact, they cost more higher in the United States here than they do any other industrialized nation on the planet. And the cabal have made sure to that, the psychiatric cabal. Again, they've paid off Congress. They have one, for every congressman, they have virtually what do you call those guys who go in there and influence these people? So they don't want a cure. They're not looking for a cure. They don't make any money on a cure. They don't make money curing people. They make money on constantly, poisoning them with these psychiatric drugs, and appointments. You can't go over the counter. In Mexico, you can walk in there over the counter and get these drugs. These are not abusable drugs. Nobody likes them. They're awful drugs. You can't even keep the psych patients on them. They throw them away. They flush them down the toilet. Nobody likes these drugs. They are not abusable. There's no reason for them to be controlled by the psychiatric mafia. In Mexico, you go to see a psychiatrist. He diagnoses you. He recommends a certain drug. After that, as long as that's working for you, you don't have to keep going back there every friggin' 6 months and paying this guy hundreds of dollars to sit out and write out a prescription that takes him 15 minutes and send you on his way, ripping off the insurance companies and everything else on the way. No wonder the health costs in the U.S. are insane, because of this mafia bull crap. So what they're spending for research now is a pittance. It's clear after manipulating the statistics for making it look like it's not a problem. It's one of the top 10 health problems in the world. Schizophrenia, and this is the way they're treating it. So those who take these drugs have this whole list of nasty, nasty symptoms. They can't sleep, neuroleptic syndrome, sexual dysfunction. They're fogged over. There's this nervous anxiety. I'll let George talk to you more about that later, because he's just recently got off those things. But they're dangerous drugs. And right now, as we speak, there are 1,194,805 children on these drugs. They are poisoning your freaking children. This is ridiculous. So what does it do? It results in an assault rate by patients against their psychiatrists that are higher than any other doctor practicing. So the assault rate on psychiatrists by patients in a study of 120,000 assaults from 1987 to 1992 over 5 years was done, comparing the assaults upon psychiatrists, doctors, and regular jobs. So the assaults for all jobs was 12.6 per thousand. The assault rate for medical doctors, other than psychiatrists, was 16.2 per thousand. The assault rate for custody staff working in psychiatric hospitals 24 hours a day around psychiatric patients was 69 per thousand. Now get the assault rate for psychiatrists. Most of these psychiatrists spend 15 or 20 minutes at the most talking to their patients. So when I was working at the state hospital, I'd go, they're only spending 15 minutes a session with these. What are they doing to piss these guys off in 15 minutes where they're getting slugged all the time? And you would look and it was only the psychiatrists who were getting slugged. It wasn't the counselors. It wasn't the psychologists. It wasn't the psych nurses. It wasn't any of the support staff. It was the psychiatrist. And one after another, you'd hear it through the prison grapevine. So what's going on there? And then you look at another factor. You figure, okay, suicide is a measure of the stability of a population. The schizophrenics have one of the highest suicide rates of any of the mentally ill. So you would say it's not a stable population, right? Then you look at the suicide rate of the normal population. It's 11 per 100,000. You look at the suicide rate of schizophrenics, it's 65 for 100,000. You look at the suicide rate of psychiatrists, it's right up there with the schizophrenics. It's I think it was 64 for 100,000. So these people are running our mental health centers. They're running our mental health system, and they spend hardly any time talking to people. They're just dishing out drugs. They're drugging everybody senseless and making a fortune doing it. And well, this is legitimate. This is what our mental health system does. So, it's clear with anybody who has worked with schizophrenics for any length of time that it's the voices that drive schizophrenia. It's the voices which cause them to do these things. How many times have you heard on TV, hey, this guy murdered a bunch of people and his voices were telling him to do it. So him and the voices get locked up. So they won't even ask. Psychiatry, educational institutions, big pharma, none of the researchers, they won't even ask the schizophrenics. What are the voices telling you? What are they doing? How are they reacting? When I saw they were running patterns, I moved in to start to disrupt those patterns. And then the voices would tell the patient, hey, we don't like him. He's pissing us off. And then they would report that to me. Until, and even after working with these people for decades, I still thought it was some faction of the subconscious mind. I didn't believe in demons. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff. I mean, they exist, but it's like, no, this is some faction of the subconscious mind. Until these guys started improving when we started disrupting what the voices were saying. And then one day, one of them comes into my office and he says, what you're doing is dangerous. And that perplexed me because I didn't think so. That's when the voices are in their heads, not mine. They can't get out. And then one came in and he said, the voices want to talk to you. And that never happened. It was always the patient would tell me what the voices were saying. And this time he comes in, he sits down, and I said, well, what do they got to say? He says, this came out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. And he said, that was the voices. And he went, that wasn't me, that was them. I didn't say that. And I said, well, tell them to go stick their head in the toilet or something like that. And he said, they can hear you, they can see you, they see you through my eyes. And that took me back too. I mean, they're looking through his eyes, they were using his ears. It's like, whoa, man. When he walked out, I was in shock. I went into shock. And it got worse it got crazier from there. There were times where I felt I was actually going nuts. But the bottom line is, if there's going to be any cure for this, the patterns that the voices run, those patterns that Mark just told you about, have to be examined. Now, we've already proved that if you break up those patterns, the patient improves. So we have two other guests here who have firsthand experience with the voices, and that's Sherri Swiney, who I've been working with. We've been fighting the deep state and the prisons and somebody for probably 30 years or close to it now. We wrote a book together, which probably wouldn't have never got done if she wasn't behind me, poking me with a hot poker. And then we also have George Jagatic, who looked me up, and I get a lot of crackpots that are writing me, and he sent me this paper, and I started reading it, and I got, hey, this guy knows what's going on, but yet he's reporting he's still struggling with the voices. So I'm like, this is interesting. And he said he worked as a therapist in a state hospital in New York. So I contacted him back, and we started working together, hammering his voices, and he's taught me about as much as I taught him. So Sherry's, I believe, got a BA in engineering, civil engineering. She worked as a civil engineer for many years. As a young woman, she struggled with the voices and found a way to beat them on her own. She would not go to a psychiatrist. She would not take those drugs. And she reasoned her way through this. I tell you, she's a lot more logical than I am. Now, George, he worked as a therapist at that state hospital. The voices, I'll let him tell you his story, but he got addicted to amphetamine, and amphetamine opens you up to these voices like nothing before. I've seen more people go psychotic on amphetamine than anybody else. So he started using them. He started hearing voices, and they got pretty bad. So he moved from New York back to his home in California. And I'd like to bring those two guys on now and let them tell you a little bit about their backgrounds and their story, because you're getting it from the horse's mouth here. I'm not just telling you that, okay, I observed this, I'm just one guy. I mean, there's hundreds of patients I work with who have exhibited these same things and have endorsed these patterns. So let's get these other guys kicking in here now, and let them tell you a little bit of their stories.
Thanks, Jerry. That was great. Yeah, I'm going to bring in Sherri and, of course, George. I think it would be great just to make a few points here, because I've been speaking to Jerry for many years, and when we first chatted over Skype, we talked for a very long time. And I was astonished by what he'd done, because I'd heard him on the internet, basically just doing some interviews, and I never thought I'd ever get to speak to him. And the incredible thing was, a friend of mine, Kevin Boyle, who's been on our shows quite a bit, who also explores this kind of area, said that he knew Jerry. So we got in touch, and we had about a 5-hour conversation on Skype. And there were things that I'd experienced that we both shared experiences. Jerry's obviously massively experienced in this field. I just had personal experience with people that I'd interacted with who unfortunately had become victims of these negative entities. And it was something I'd been fascinated with for years. So I've just been reading the comments. Yeah, some people are talking about psychology and psychiatry, and it's quite interesting to see the comments. And I do generally think we have quite an informed audience, but this is an area where I think people can be kind of swayed off the path in a way, because they will say, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be something else. We're trying to bring you an absolute way of looking at this, because when you look at all the evidence, and I've actually experienced these negative entities attacking, and I've had quite a few experiences of this. And if people aren't aware, then these things can just jump in. And there are many examples of this. There's a great book actually written by Private George Ritchie in the 50s, where he left his body and he saw his drunken friends at the RAF or US Air Force bar getting drunker and drunker when he was out of his body, when he was meant to have died. And he could actually see the negative entities jumping in because they were paralyzed or paralytic with alcohol. And of course, these negative entities feed off drugs and alcohol. I say, of course, because that's been my understanding of it. We're now going to bring in George, and I'm going to leave Jerry up to speak with George so you can hear both of them. So I'm just going to bring in George now. George, join us.
Hi, Mark. Good to see you. Hi, Jerry. Glad to be here.
Well, go for it. If you can relate any of your experiences to any of these patterns to make it more real for the people who are struggling with this stuff, and you had an incredible, one of the things that happen is these people almost always struggle with what are the voices, where they come from, what are they, what are they doing? And George is one of the most honest people I've ever seen. He's just so straightforward. He doesn't hide anything. He just comes out with anything, which makes him very interesting to work with. But they all struggle, and they come to three conclusions. Basically, they break up into three. They either believe the psychiatric mafia that these voices are due to a broken brain and there's a chemical imbalance, or they don't know, or they think they're demons. And George has a really good story about when he was struggling to figure out what they were and how they operated, and he was trying to find some hardcore evidence that these things were real and not just some hallucination. So I'll turn it over to you, George, and go for it.
Sure. First of all, I'll give you a little bit about my background. I worked in the field of mental health for many years, and I worked in an acute care setting. So I was very familiar with schizophrenic patients, bipolar, major depression, so on and so forth. So I had seen and been around people who hear voices, and just like you said, in all of my education, all my schooling, it was about hallucinations. How do you deal with somebody who believes something that is not real? Well, when I started hearing the voices, it was because of a amphetamine addiction that I struggled with for many years. Currently now I've been sober for a couple of years, and thank God. But I've still have had this experience of hearing voices. Now I have to say it's changed over the years, and I have been able to get it under control to a certain extent, and have had the voices go down an extremely great amount from where they used to be. So if the trajectory is on the right path, I'm looking forward to not having these voices around in a short period of time, but we'll see how that goes.
Hey, George, could you regress a little bit and tell them about your experience with psychiatry when you first went to a psychiatrist? What was that like? And then what were the drugs like? What did they feel like when you started using them? What was
Sure.
your experience with psychiatry?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that the experience of starting to hear voices, or starting to hear something that is not there, is life-changing. It is something that one can almost barely put into words, and how challenging it is, what a difficult experience it is when you have an experience of hearing something that is so in your experience of reality, that is so constant and pervasive. It is extremely challenging to overcome, extremely challenging. And so one of the paths that people have is psychiatry. And one of the paths in psychiatry that is utilized is medicines and antipsychotic medications. When I first started hearing the voices, it was pervasive. It was overwhelmingly loud, and it had a strong influence on what I did in this reality. And so I needed to get that under control, and I knew that one option was psychiatry. So I went and I got prescribed medication, and that medication had some really, really, really awful side effects. Such that I couldn't sit down. I always had to be moving. It messed with my sleep patterns. Sometimes it got me really, really exhausted to where I couldn't move, and so it just messed with my sense of stability. I think chemical stability is what it felt like.
Did it get rid of the voices?
When I first started taking the antipsychotics, the intensity of the voices went down, I would say about 20 or 30%. but I eventually weaned myself off of the antipsychotics, and being off them at this point has not had any great detriment or positive effect. I think over the couple years that I have been hearing it, the things that have been the most influential are the things that I have done to heal myself in other ways, in my own sobriety, in my own spiritual world, in my own ability to retain my sense of self in my mind. And I think that was brought up earlier. That sense of self you've got to hold on to, because what you are experiencing, for somebody who hears voices, they're hearing words, and the words have meaning, and the sentences and the storylines that get built up create your reality, and they change and they alter how you think about this reality, and they affect your behavior. And that has a huge influence. That influence is it can be frightening. We've talked about it, how voices can say go out and kill somebody, and people will follow the voice's orders. And I think there's that sense of control that the voices have always wanted to establish within me. But maintaining my sense of self within it and keeping the voices separate has been my way of maintaining a certain sense of stability and sanity, and has lessened the severity of what I've been hearing over the course of the years.
So, George, how did you come to the conclusion that these things weren't your thoughts, but were actually something exterior to you, something that didn't belong in your head? How did there's usually a struggle there? Could you tell us about that struggle?
Well, I mean, the entire story is a little complex and convoluted. When I first started hearing it, it actually sounded like something coming from in the room, and I thought it was the neighbors who were speaking. I was living in a New York apartment at the time, and as time went by, I realized it wasn't in the room. I realized it was in my head, because I could think a response, and the voices would then answer. And I thought, oh, okay, so this is internalized. This is something that's happening inside of me. At that point, I thought, okay, so this could be unconscious material. This is stuff that I'm creating that is coming from me. And that was what I learned in school. And so I as in the initial stages of hearing the voices, that relationship that was a curiosity. It was like, well, what is coming up for me? And there was stuff that was coming up that would interact with me in ways that I would never interact with myself, telling me that we're going to kill you, we're going to hunt you down, we're going to shoot you when you go out, things that got me scared. And I thought, well, why would I be doing that to myself? Okay, so to this day, I have no idea where these voices are coming from. I have no idea. What I do know is that they are absolutely 100% ego dystonic, which is separate from myself. Now, how do I know that? Over the course of the years, there have been a number of instances that have come through that have proven themselves to be not from me. For example, in the beginning stages, I was very paranoid, and I thought the voices had some control over what was happening in my computer. Well, I wanted the password changed, and I didn't want to know what the password was, so I called somebody over to change the password. I went in the other room while they dealt with the password change, and was washing my hands in the bathroom, and one of the voices said to another voice in my head, he's changing the password to password. That was new information. It was absolutely something I not only did not know, but did not want to know. So I immediately went out to my friend who was changing the password, and I said, are you changing the password to password? And he looked at me, he said, yes, how did you know? And I said, well, the voices in my head just told me that. So that was one example of a way to show me that this was something that was outside of my head, and to prove to that. There was another example one time where the voices told me, you're going to be scared when the electricity goes off 3 times. And not a week later, but in the house that I was living in at the time, the electricity went off 3 times that day, and that has never happened before. So there was a predictive quality to what I had heard. Now, where this comes from, how this comes about, what these things are that were predictive, that were telling me things that somebody else was doing, I have no idea what they are. I know that they're not me. And I think what a lot of people get confused is that you can have a voice to your own thoughts. You can have a voice to what is going on in your head, And if you don't separate out, if you aren't able to discern that there are other voices that can come in, intrusive voices that can interject their own motivations, their own intention into what you're thinking, you begin to think that those are yours. And that's where it gets confusing, and that's where it gets insidious, because if you begin thinking these negative thoughts, if you begin thinking these awful things that aren't necessarily you, go kill yourself, go kill somebody else, this person's out to get you, this person doesn't love you, it changes how you behave, and it degrades a loving relational aspect of being in this world, being present in this world. And I think that's what's the main thing that is so important. Is I always held on to the priority of this world, the priority of sense of self, and the priority of what was real in this world, and I discounted what the voices were saying. As soon as I began to realize I was dealing with some kind of an entity that was being intrusive on me, and it was interesting in my story, I think, that at the beginning, when I first started hearing the voices, there was a back and forth. There was a positive and negative, and there were elements of the voices themselves trying to win me in, to pull me over, to get me to buy into what they were saying. Well, after a while, when I was relating to them and I was having some kind of symbiotic relationship, it would turn and it would get nasty and it would get ugly and it would get very dark. For example, one time the voices were teaching me how to cleanse myself in a way that like for an exorcism or for a baptism, and then I made it all the way to church, and then the voices told me to urinate in my pants before I went into the church. And so it was, you see what I mean? It was like, it started off really nice that we're going to church, we're going to do this good thing. And then it got really bad and it got really dark. And it was like, okay, wait a second. This is just not the end product of something that is supposed to be good, supposed to be loving, supposed to be of God. Because at first, that's what the voices told me. They said, we are the word of God. So I said, I don't think so. I don't believe that. And then they said, you were Jesus. And I said, no, I'm just George. Again, I held on to my sense of self. And that sense of self really kept me together through this experience that was pulling me in and out of this reality. And it pulled me in and out in different ways. And ways initially that I went along with. And then up to a point when I saw that it was about control and it was about wanting me to do things that were against who I was, I put my foot down and I said no. And I one of the reasons that I'm here today to talk about it is not to say I know what these things are, here's what it is, because I don't. I can't prove what it is. I know that there is something that is real, that is intrusive in my mind and has an intention, has a thought process behind it, and has for the most part, there has been a huge amount of negative influence or attempts to be negative in my life. But what I found is I have found ways of putting up barriers, putting up boundaries that have been really clear to maintain my sense of self. And if there's any way I can help people out there to understand that if you have a thought, you've got to ask yourself, was that me? Or was that something else? If you can begin to differentiate between self and other, I think that's the beginning stages of moving forward in a healthy way in this life, dealing with these intrusive entities. And I use the word entities because it is something. It is something that is real, that is out there, that has intruded into the sanctity of my mind. And in fact, early on, these entities asked me that question. They said, what do you think about sanctity of the mind? They asked me that question. And it was interesting because that was what was taken away from me, was that sanctity of the mind. Some of the other boundaries that were really important for me was that I found my own inner voice. And so there are times that I could hear myself thinking in my head, my thoughts. Again, you have to differentiate your thoughts between the other's thoughts. And when the negative entities would begin talking to me or screaming at me or would begin to say anything at me, I would overtalk them. And this overtalking would block the meaning of what they were trying to get me to believe or buy into. It would stop it from getting through. And that has saved me over and over and over and over again. And it was a way of putting a boundary, putting a wall up between me and these voices, stopping the meaning, stopping what I was hearing of getting through by over talking it. Now, if that's not possible, I think there's other ways that Jerry and Sherri have talked about that. It's a lie program. If you begin to have conversations with these voices, you've got to understand that a lot of what they say is simply a lie or is simply another reality. And it's like, no, I don't believe that. That is not who I am. That's not what I believe. That is a lie. And then you move forward in this reality with this priority. If the voices tell you that person doesn't like you, that's a lie. I don't believe it. And then you move forward in this reality. And if you want to go as far as to talk to that person and say, hey, check in, how's our relationship doing? You know, anything I need to check in with you about? It's this reality that is the priority, not the voices in your head, because what happens is the voices try to pull you away from this reality into some made up belief system in your head that is co-created with you and the voices. And it can be done in a very, very negative way. So there's something that is insidious that is happening. And there are ways that I think people need to be aware of how to protect themselves from this, how to become aware of these things that are out there that are impinging themselves on who we are as human beings in our thought process, in our day-to-day lives. And Mark, I think you talked about that quite well as you opened the show.
I thought it was really fascinating what you said, George. And incidentally, you look a lot better than when we last talked. I don't know whether it was because it was later at night or something, but you seem to be a lot more focused. And what you said there to me was quite extraordinary, because it's the way that I've been trying to explain this, and you did it perfectly, in that you are consciously aware that you are in the presence of something else. And this is the battle. This is what it's about, because I was going to bring something up that I was going to ask you about. Have you ever been in a situation with these voices where you knew they were leading you into an impending catastrophe, and you were able to possibly see that and keep yourself focused within your own energy? And I did experience this once with someone around me who was having a very serious episode. And I knew that it was a life and death situation. Yet I was basically just holding on to my own sanity and my own awareness. Have you ever experienced anything like that?
I think there's a lot of times that the voices want to take me down paths that are very dark, that are very paranoid, are very insular. And I immediately, what I did, and I think, again, is a saving grace, is what everybody needs to do, is you need to check in with a loved one. You need to check in with a therapist. You need to check in with somebody in this reality and say, here's what I'm thinking. You know, what is your reaction to that thought? And I would, when these intrusive voices, when these intrusive thoughts would come into my head that were very dark, I would say, this is what I'm experiencing and hearing right now. What do you think of that? And a lot of times the reactions I would get were, that's awful. That's crazy. That, you know, God would never do that. Jesus would never do that. This isn't loving. This isn't something that that a loving direction, an open direction of being is. And so talking about what I was experiencing constantly, I never hid what I was experiencing. And that, I think, is so important, because these voices are insidious. They're constant. They're every single day, every moment of your day. And they can build these stories up very slowly, these belief systems and these belief structures up very slowly. And you almost don't realize that it's happening until you're at this point where you have built up enough belief that it flips you into something dark, into something negative. And I never got that far, because all the things that I was doing along the way, talking about it, maintaining my sense of self, checking in with friends, doing talking them, doing the It's Alive program, and using prayer and spirituality. Prayer and spirituality was huge for me, and I really believe in the power of prayer and how my own spiritual body early on in this process was compromised horribly, and how this is my recovery through that.
Yeah, that's brilliant, because some people who have this happen to them when it comes in, especially through abuse, which they have no control over, it's a lot more catastrophic, because they literally do lose a lot of their own cognition and ability to react in any way against it. They basically have opened up a channel, and this is a very dangerous thing, and something that I've looked into. It sounds as though you always stayed kind of on the right side of things and weren't drawn into anything catastrophic. That's what I was trying to get to, because your work as a therapist obviously seems to have helped you in that you looked at this whole thing rationally, which is what I find very fascinating, because you don't leave any areas that are ambiguous, which I think is extremely powerful. Your reinforcement of the That's a Lie program, in other words, when these intrusions come in and you say, that's not me, that's a lie, that helped a friend of mine to stay alive. It was very harrowing. I've talked about it to Jerry, but it was a life and death situation. There were injuries and it was very close, but I managed to stay completely strong on the end of the phone. But what I got was this terrible feeling of electricity invading me in a very dark way. And this is what me and Jerry originally talked about, this kind of intrusion that happens. I don't know what that is. That's for sure. But yeah, I think you're a real inspiration there, George, with what you've gone through and the way you present it. I think we maybe should bring back in Jerry, and then he can introduce Sherri Swiney, our last guest for tonight.
Well, Mark, just to underscore you a couple of times, and that electrical intrusion in your body. There were many times over the course of this experience in which I felt that there was something that actually affected my body, not just voices, but affected my feelings and affected my physical body. And if I could just quickly tell the story, there was one voice in my head that I called the town crier. I imagined him as a young boy. Now, this is absolutely true, and is something that really opened up my head to the wider universe, because of how unbelievable it was. But in any case, the town crier was one character in my head. One evening, I was having a conversation with town crier in my head, and he told me he was in the garage. So I actually went out to the garage and I opened the door, and town crier said he came into the room I was in. There was another door. It was a vestibule that was shut, and he and I were in that vestibule. I went out of the vestibule, turned the light on, and town crier in my head was saying, no, turn the light off, turn the light off, turn the light off. So I opened the door and went into the bedroom that I was in. I laid down on the bed and I felt this entity invade my body, and I felt this entity in my chest, and I felt a tightening of my entire chest, and I felt there was this internal struggle going on, almost as if this entity was wanting to stop my heart. And I lay there, and energetically I pushed this being out of my body, and it left, and town crier was gone out of my head and gone out of my body. Now, I live with my stepfather, who's 94 and blind, completely blind. And my stepfather sees people coming through the bedroom at night. Well, the next morning, before I ever said anything to him about the experience that I had the night before, he said, I saw somebody come through my room last night. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. Who was it? He says it was somebody new. It was a young boy. Now, and that's exactly who town crier was. So here's this situation where he and I, in two separate rooms, both experienced an entity of a young man. One was in my body that was battling me, and one was a vision that he had, and he's completely blind. So, I mean, if that doesn't shake you to your core, I don't know what does. These things are real, and they play out in different ways. But they are a part of our reality and part of something that we need to be aware of in ways that most people aren't.
That's really brilliant, George. Yeah, I had a very, very similar experience many years ago. And I was told by a friend of mine that somebody had hung themselves the night before I'd been in this flat. But I don't think that's necessarily what was attacking me. It's very interesting to try and find out really what's going on here, because I think some people get attached to these entities, or this entity had attached itself to a friend of mine, and basically it jumped into me. And I had a very similar experience to what you're talking about. It was like a blue-black kind of energy that attacked my chest. It just went in. It was like a force that hit me in the chest, as though it was trying to get into my body. And it bounced off. And that's what I'm talking about. If you open yourself up too much and get out of control, or through this abuse, I think the abuse just absolutely degenerates the energy field. And these things can just jump into people. And that's when they become possessed over time, because they're not dealing with it. And these things take more and more control, especially if you have low self-esteem, because that they often, in my experience, people with low self-esteem or have had abuse or trauma or drugs to a great extent, that's what opens the gateway. So we're talking about gateways here. And what we're trying to say tonight, I think, is that these gateways can be closed and you can protect yourself. Would you just like to finish off there, George?
Sure. And I think when you talk about these gateways being closed and protecting yourself, if we're talking about negative entities, the opposite side of that is positivity or love. Or how do you deal with negativity? We are living here in America. We're living in such a time now where there's such anger and such violence and such hatred, and we are a country that is divided in so many ways. And it makes me think how many of these entities are just constantly just inciting this anger and building this anger up in each one of us, to cause these reactions in these situations that we see around us. And I think it's interesting at the same time that we have trauma-informed care that is coming out, and that is slowly being opened up to the public as a new perspective and a new way of being, understanding trauma, understanding how a person, it's not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And how can we move forward in a more loving way? And I think that's the bottom line here, is to hold love in your heart, to deal with these entities in a way that is neutral or loving to yourself, and that holding on to a respect for yourself, a love for yourself. I think there's many different ways that one can attain that perspective, whether it's through religion, spirituality, or a loving family. But having that in your life is one way of healing these spiritual wounds, or these traumatic incidences that actually are what you had used the word gateways, where this negativity can come in and just rip apart your sense of security in this reality, where you can begin to become paranoid, where you can begin to have fear run your life. And that's what we don't want, is we don't want fear to run your life. And I think that was one of the big things that I held on to, is whenever whatever the entities were telling me, were trying to make me to believe, that would cause fear, I would let that go and say, I don't believe it. It's a lie. And it kept telling me that this is a life sentence. This is a life sentence. This is a life sentence. I said, no, I don't believe it. It's a lie. You're going away, and you will go away. And they have. And so that fighting that fear, holding that sense of self, holding on to loving thoughts, and being the best that you can be, is the thing that pulls you up and away from this negativity. And I think we all have to hold on to that in ways that support each other. One of the biggest ways is living for others. You can't be selfish. You can't just live for yourself. You have to live for others. And this is my way of putting something out into the world that is true, that it's a true experience for me. Here are things that have helped me, and here are things I really actually believe that can help us, all of us, fight against the negativity that energetically affects us. And I think we have to do that on a daily basis, because we all get pulled down, and we get mired in how these entities affect us. We're spiritual beings living in this world, and we cannot forget that we are spiritual beings, and we do. And I think these voices are ways to remind us that yes, we have to stay connected to our spirituality and to our sense of connection to each other in a way that's loving, in a way that's supportive, and a way that's helpful.
That's brilliant, George. I think you summed up that perfectly, and a great time now to bring back in Jerry and then Sherri. I think Jerry should introduce Sherri, because Jerry and Sherri have actually worked on a book, and I think we should talk about that too. So I'm going to bring in Jerry. Thanks, George. If you can just take a bit of a rest, we might bring you back in to sum things up at the end.
Real bad on my screen, George, or Mark. So I can barely hear you sometimes.
Oh, right.
Sherri,
Okay.
your microphone is off, Sherri.
So we're just now going to introduce Jerry and Sherri. Have we got you both?
Yeah, you got me now. My electricity went out here, so I got kicked off. I had to come back in.
Oh, right. Okay.
Well, let me quickly cap off with some of the stuff George said, and then we'll move on to Sherri here. But, while I was working in the prison, the prisoners would tell me that the voices would tell them which houses to rob, when to rob, which window to go in, generally where the loot was, when to leave, when the people were up, where to hide. I had one tell him where a giant sesame oil marijuana field was in Northern California. He drove from San Diego to way up Northern California, followed all these back roads and dirt roads up to the base of this mountain. Voices guiding him all the way. 4 hours later, he walked up the mountain and he found this giant sesame oil pot field. So they know things that we don't. I had prisoners tell me that the voices would tell them where to be and when to be there to get some more amphetamine. And a total stranger walks up and has the amphetamine. I had one in the ER told me that as soon as I walked into the ER, her voices told her, this guy's dangerous, stay away from him. So, they know things. It's like Castaneda says, they give you their mind. This is like a mind virus. And as George said, he attacked the voices. He fought back against the voices. He went off the drugs. When he disrupted and weakened those voices enough, they started disappearing, but it was a battle. So he wasn't putting, the responsibility on psychiatry and say, give me a pill, I'm helpless, I can't do anything about this. He took an active role in standing up to and fighting the voices and separating them out. Now that's real difficult, because I've had scores of patients ask their voices, who are you? What are you? And they would say, we are you. They don't want you to know that you have a separate mind. We've been taught from the time we were born that whatever thoughts come in our mind belong to us. And they're playing full advantage of that. People don't realize that other voices come into their heads, other thoughts come into their heads, and they don't belong to them. And like George said, we are spiritual beings, and psychiatry and psychology has no room for that. And until they do, they're not going to have any cure for any mental illness. We're spiritual beings. We have spiritual issues, and you can't cure a spiritual crisis with friggin' toxic drugs. So at that, I'll turn it over to Sherri. Like Sherri and I work together like I said, we've been fighting the cabal and prisons and deep state for like 30 years, man. She's my partner in crime with all these stand-ups against the prisons, against the psychiatric mafia. Wasn't for her that our book wouldn't. I got it behind my shoulder there. We would have never got it finished. I don't think. I'd still be working on it. So she's kind of like my prodder. I mean, she keeps me moving when I start getting tired or stalled out. And she started hearing these voices when she was a young woman, and they almost killed her. She refused to take drugs. She analyzed the situation kind of like what George did, took responsibility for it. And I'll turn you over to her. She's very smart. She's very unusual, because she's an engineer. She's a civil engineer, so she's got one foot in the rational engineering mathematics. I mean, she knows a lot more about computers than I do and has a lot more tolerance for them. And the other foot is in the spiritual world. So she's a unique combination that is incredible. And I'm always impressed by her. So I'll turn over things to her right now. Let her tell you her story.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. I appreciate that. And thank you, Mark, for asking me to come on. And it was nice hearing your testimony, George. It gives, I think, hearing testimonies from people who have either reduced their voices or gotten rid of them completely is very powerful to those who are struggling right now. Now, I didn't hear audible voices like George did. What happened to me was that I would be invaded by my thoughts. And the thoughts that came into my mind were not my thoughts. They weren't things that I was thinking at all. They would pop in, they would do their damage, and they would affect my body and my thinking. You have to know too that I was brainwashed when I was little through torture. And so I had the brainwashing to deal with, and then I had the voices to deal with at the same time. So my goal was to, when I realized that I was brainwashed, I didn't realize that until I was in my 30s. When I finally woke up to that, I thought, oh my God, I'm brainwashed. What do I do? How do I stop this? Because I noticed that I was having reactions to certain things that were completely out of proportion to what was happening in whatever situation it was. And then I had this memory block for the first 13 years of my life, which was when the torture happened. So not having any memory of that, it's the tortures and the brainwashing still affected how I acted around people and in public and in my life. And I didn't know it. So when I had a huge shock that awakened all these memories and came to me like a tsunami all at one time, I was overwhelmed completely. And when that happened, I thought, I didn't know what to think, because these memories just came flooding back, and they were horrible, horrific memories.
Hey, Sherri, tell the story about the baby in the orphanage with the hot water, where the voices or the thoughts were telling you, and how that came about, and how'd you respond to that?
Well, when I was in the orphanage, I was in a Catholic orphanage. When I entered the orphanage when I was 6.5 years old. So I was in the second group. They had the groups of girls. There were 500 girls in this orphanage, and we were separated by groups according to our age. So I was in the second group, and I think it was called the second band. And then they had the pixie group, which was the babies. So the second band was in charge of bathing the babies. So my first assignment was to bathe this little girl, and she was just a tiny little thing. I think she was like maybe 3 years old, 2 years old, something like that. So my assignment was to give her a bath, and so I ran the hot water in the tub, and then I went to all of a sudden I went to turn the cold water on to cool it off to get it the right temperature. But all of a sudden I had this thought in my mind, oh, just put her in, she'll be fine, just do it. And so I picked her up and I went to put her in the tub, and the moment her toe hit the hot water, she screamed, and then I realized what was going on, and I pulled her out. I didn't dunk her in, thank God. So I pulled her out and I grabbed her and I hugged her real, real tight. And she was crying, and then I was crying, and I was like, oh my God, what have I almost done to this little girl? So then I defiantly turned on the cold water. You have to understand, I was like 7 years old at the time, and I felt like I was defying the universe. I mean, it was very, very powerful. So I defiantly turned on the cold water, and got the bath regular temperature and bathed the little girl and without any incident. But when I got back to my ward, I laid on my bed and I cried my eyes out for, I don't know, hours, feeling shame and guilt of what I almost did. And I thought this was my father's thoughts, because this was something he would have done. He was the one that did the torture to me when I was younger than that. So for the longest time, I thought that that's what that was. So these thoughts just pop into your mind. They tell you to do weird and dangerous things to yourself or to others. But thank God I had the presence of mind to defy that, because it wasn't in me to hurt anybody.
And a lot of times they sound just like your regular thoughts, and they don't want you to discern them as different. So they'll tell you they're you, and that's what we're taught as kids. Now, with the just do it thing, I've heard that so many times from suicidal people I've been working with. The voices will tell them, just do it. Just do it. You're a burden on everybody. You're dragging everybody down. You're worthless. You're stupid. Just kill yourself and do everybody a favor. I mean, I've heard that scores of times. And the other thing is after the voices attack, there's generally an energy drain where the person is drained. I mean, just eviscerated. Their energy is gone. I've had some prisoners say they couldn't even get out of bed. And that's very consistent. So you guys want to say anything about that? I'm sure you've experienced it.
Well, yeah, I mean, when the thoughts, I'll call them voices, but remember that they were not audible voices for me.
But they sound just like your thoughts.
Yeah, they sound just like my own thoughts. But
the intention is very different. So you hear a thought in your head and you go, God, that's awful. I'd never do that. And its intention is way different from what anything you would ever do or even really entertain doing.
That's right.
Go ahead and tell about the energy drain, Sherri.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a real thing, that our bodies are energy. And so when you go into a negative state of mind and they suck your energy out, you have no life energy, hardly any life energy left to function.
So these things are parasites, and I've had scores of patients tell me they could actually feel their energy leaving when they were under attack by these voices over and over and over again. It was so consistent that I'm like, what is going on here? What is going on here? And I always thought it was because of the anxiety that these things cause, because they can cause an awful lot. And then I was over the jail for the prison where the nastiest of the nastiest were one day. And there were two prisoners together. And one was psychotic and one wasn't. And the one who they were in the same cell under the same conditions, feeding the same food, everything. I mean, it was a perfect experimental situation. The guy who was one guy was psychotic, the other guy wasn't. The other guy, the gangsters wanted him dead. They had followed him into that facility. They got in trouble so they could kill him. And then he's locked in this room with this flaming schizophrenic who had no medication standing over him 3 a.m, staring down at him. And the gangsters on the outside sending messages under his door telling him they were going to kill him as soon as he came out. So you couldn't be under too much more stress than that. And I interviewed them one after the other, after both in the same cell, perfect experimental situation. The guy who was not hearing voices had 10 times more energy than the one who was hearing the voices. And I walked out of there and I went, it's not anxiety. It's not anxiety. The voices are taking whatever these things are. They're withdrawing the energy from these people. They're taking it.
So what I'd like to focus on is what these beings are. They've been with us for thousands of years, as Mark has talked about. When I first learned about the Nag Hammadi library, and that the books were talking about the archons being our rulers, our leaders, I thought, because prior to that, all I could call them was entities. But when I discovered what the Nag Hammadi library papers were saying, I just said, oh my Lord, they have a name. You know, that was my first introduction to that they actually had a name. So anyway, these things have been with us since the beginning. And it's time for the information to come out to the public to let everybody know that everybody is attacked in one level or another. And anytime a person has a negative thought about themselves or about others, that's not coming from them. That's coming from an attack from these entities that comes from the outside in, not the inside out. And it may be subtle for a lot of people, and it's severe for the schizophrenics. That's the top end of the severity. But they have invaded everybody on this planet, and they have invaded our current political leaders and corporate leaders, and they are driving the actions on this planet that we're seeing today. I'm convinced of that. I mean,
I am too.
I see it all the time. So I don't want to get into the politics because all of that is baloney, because it's driven by these entities, and they're having a field day. They're having a major feast on everybody who is frightened about the lies that are being told by mainstream media and some alternative media.
They feed off of negative emotional energy. That's what they suck. They can't stand positive energy. So they generate that by the crap that they put into your head. And everybody experiences these things from time to time. A thought comes into your head that's just horrendously negative and nasty. And you go, where did that come from? It's obvious it doesn't belong to you. But nobody asks, where did that come from? You just assume that it's yours because that's what you've been taught all your life.
Right. So there's an antidote to it. And I learned what the antidote was. There's 2 levels of antidotes. First of all, we have to know that when we arrive here on earth as a baby, we are spiritual beings and we are made with love. We are made by love. So we are love. We are genuinely love. The energy of love. We don't know anything other than that when we first arrive here. The programming that we get from the moment we arrive, whether it's from our parents who were misinformed in the first place by their parents and on and on and on down the generations, or our schools or our churches or our institutions. And like Jerry said, the pharmaceutical company has really done a bang up job of putting the wool over everybody's eyes. So here we are, we're being bombarded with all this negative programming. It's a program that we get as children, and we take that with us as we grow up. And so we only know what we've been taught to believe. That's why there's so many different opinions and so many different beliefs and so many lies and so on like that. But the bottom line is we are love. And those creatures that are invading us are lying to us. They're lying to us through the media. They're lying to us through the churches. They're lying to us through religions. They're lying to us through politics. They're lying to us through corporations. They're lying to us through the banks, whatever. It's all lies. And the hardest thing for people to realize when you stop to think about it is everything you have learned in your lifetime, which is based on what people tell you, is from others. And all of it is not true. None of it is true. None of it relates to who you are as a spiritual entity. We're in a spiritual war. We're in a big, huge spiritual battle. And the sooner people realize that, the better off they'll be, and the better off the whole planet will be. So here's my antidote. This is step 1. Know that you are made with love and you are made by love, and that you don't have any negativity in you when you first arrive, and that everything you're hearing in your mind is a lie. So when these negative thoughts or voices or whatever enter your being and tell you all this negative stuff, know that it's not coming from you, and know that it's a lie and call it out. That's a lie. I developed this That's a Lie program, and there's a link to it on my website, and there's also a link to it on Jerry's website. And we have had testimonies from a lot of people, quite a few people. I've posted some of them that are just amazed at how effective this very simple program is to work. And I think
breaks up the voices. They can't get a hold when you use Sherri's program.
Well,
I've taken it out to the prison and I've put it to work, and it works. It does work if you consistently use it.
Right. So then the second evolved step that I have found is when I get up in the morning, one of the first things that I do is, before I even get out of bed, is to say, I am love. I am made with love. I radiate love. I love and I am loved, because I know that I'm loved because I was made with love, and so is everybody else. So that puts a protective shield around me right away. And then when I go out on the porch and have my coffee in the morning, I say it again. And I just close my eyes and imagine that I am love. And I imagine that I am loved. And I imagine that I am radiating love around myself and the whole planet. So I think if more people did that, we would see a reduction in the negativity on this planet. I believe that the truth is coming out from all the politicians and stuff like that. All that stuff is coming out. I don't know if we're in our end times or not biblically, but it sure feels like it. And I'm not I studied the Bible from cover to cover, and I studied the Nag Hammadi library, not from cover to cover, but a lot of it. And I've studied ancient scriptures. And it's possible that we're in the end times. I don't really know, but it feels like maybe that's what's going on. But whatever it is, I know we're in a spiritual battle, and it's time for everybody to realize more strongly than they ever have how important all these lies are that are being told to them. They're all lies. And so we are not our physical body. We are more than our physical body.
You need to tell psychiatry that.
Psychiatry is run by the entities, and they're not going to listen.
You're right.
Psychiatry is a gateway, one of the gateways to realizing the truth of who we are. So that's my message to everybody. You can get rid of these voices. You can get rid of these negative thoughts. They're always going to come around and test the waters. And, I had an attack after I did a show with, I think it was Judith Koba in Germany. So I had an attack after that, and I thought, well, okay, so here you are trying again, la, la, la. I know what your game is, so I know you're lying. So, that's it. I send you love. And they were gone in a flash. So that's to me, that's an easy way to get rid of them.
Yeah, you have to fight back against them. And until psychiatry realizes, and the medical field realizes, that we're spiritual beings, especially in psychiatry, they're not going to have a cure for any kind of mental illness. So everybody hears these things, and they will try to drive you or steer you away from any positive spiritual pursuit. You got something more important to do, or don't read any kind of spiritual book. They'll try to drive you away from your creator in any way they can.
Well, that's why the That's a Lie program is so effective, because it's so easy to remember. It's much easier than any long dissertation or anything like that. So when they try to distract you, and they're distracting millions of people on the planet today, but if we can get the word out that there is an easy way to remember, And even if you don't think it's a lie, but you're having a negative thought and you say that's a lie, and you keep it up and be consistent with it over time, you'll realize it's a lie. And then you'll realize that these thoughts and these voices are not yours. They're not yours. They don't belong to you. So don't own them.
So that's one of the reasons Sherri and I wrote this book. I mean, I don't know how many hundreds of mothers I've had over the years that just, what do I do? How do I handle this? What are these things? What are the voices? Why is my son acting so crazy? What is going on with him? And they go ask the psychiatrist, and they all they get is, well, his brain is now broken and he's got to take these toxic pills for the rest of his life. So what we've done is piece together what is actually going on with these people and what these things are, where they come from, and how to handle it. And we wrote this book together here. And you can get it on our website at jerrymarzinski.com. And George, if you would, you read this, and would you give listeners your impression of what was the reaction of you and your voices? Well, how did the voices react to this, and how did you react to the information that was in this book?
First of all, I think it's anybody who's interested in voices or the field of mental health, I think it's an excellent read, and it's a great way to begin to have some perspective on what that experience is. Working with you, Jerry, it has been an interesting roller coaster with the voices, because so often what the voices say is, this is not what we want. This is not what we want.
Yeah, no doubt. They probably don't like me very well either.
Right. But I think, when you're dealing with putting up boundaries with entities that are of a realm I am not clear about, but those boundaries create conflict. And that conflict comes through. And when I get that conflict, I say to myself, well, that's not of a loving being. If I go against what an entity is saying, and then they come back and they berate me, or they give me conflict, or they talk down to me, I know that I've done the right thing. And I think one of the important things about Sherri's program, the It's a Lie program, is that it helps you maintain your boundaries. And I think that's what we have to do, because these voices, these thoughts, this energetic component, it has influence. And if it influences us in a negative way, and if that's what its motivation is, then it's winning. And we can't have that. We've got to have the influence, the strength, the inner strength, and the boundaries to move back to positivity, to love, to respect, and to sanctity of the mind.
Yeah, one thing about the That's a Lie program is when you work it enough, you're actually reprogramming your subconscious, which is allowing your conscious mind to be more present. So because your subconscious is programmed with all these programs that you've received since you were a child, and those are like they're like tape recordings. They can be erased. They can be reprogrammed eventually, but that takes an awful lot of work. So you have to start with at least that's a lie. And if you keep it up over time, you not only get rid of the voices, but you reprogram your subconscious to the point where, okay, I now know that everything that I learned as a child was a lie. And I know that I'm not the person that I was told that I was, because as a child, I was told that, I'll never amount to anything. I'm no good. I'm a bad person, blah, 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 just like everybody else who's heard voices or had negative thoughts, and why don't I just end it all and save everybody a whole bunch of trouble and so on like that. And we've all heard these thoughts at one time or another. Some people, unfortunately, follow through with that. And that's really a tragedy, because those thoughts were not theirs in the first place. So it's important to start working at this, because you eventually reprogram your subconscious. And that's a huge thing for those who actually do it. They notice a big, huge change in their life. And, the people that were negative around them seem to disappear. And then good people come into their lives.
Yeah, got to be held in mind that these things feed off of negative emotional energy. So if you look at the pattern and the content of what they put into your head, it is all designed to produce fear, guilt, shame, all kinds of negative emotional energy of all kinds. That's what they feed off of. And you look at the bigger picture of what's happening now on the planet. Look at what we're being told. You're going to die. You got coronavirus. You better put these dirty rags over your mouth. Everybody's dying. The emergency rooms are full. China was showing pictures of people dead on the street. 5 billion cases all over the place. People dropping dead in the stores. I mean, it's all designed to generate fear. So they're operating, like Sherri said, they're operating through the politicians right now. They're operating through the governments. And they're trying to gain more and more power and more control, which is their two MOs. They want power. They want control. And that's what the individual voices do also. And George can probably talk to that. Their entire existence is striving for power and control over the individual. Do you want to say something about that, George?
Yeah, they made it very clear to me at one point. We initially, as I said before, started with some kind of an amiable relationship where I was actually conversing with them, and I was working with them and was opening myself up to their inquisition, as it were, in a way that was relational. Well, it got to a point where they began mandating dictates, and they said, "Well, you have to be vegan." I said, well, I'll try being vegan for a while, which I did. I actually tried for a very short period of time, but it's not me. It's not who I am. So no, I'm not going to be vegan. And as soon as I went against their dictate, they got angry at me. And that was one example of many ways in which they have wanted control. They wanted me to, everything you could think of. They wanted me to move away from home. They wanted me to ask them whenever I left the home, I had to ask them permission. They wanted me to check in with them all the time, and they told me, it was about control, and it made it very clear to me. And I said, well, no, this, look, I'm an adult. I have free reign here. I'm, living my life in a way that I can have control over my own life, and I will. And they didn't like that.
Right, and that's what our government is doing to us now. They want to control us. They want to spy on us. And as children, we've become accustomed to being watched all the time. Even, and I mentioned this in the book, that even the Santa Claus story, he sees you when you're sleeping. He sees you when you're awake. He knows if you've been good or bad. So that gives the child the idea that, somebody's watching them all the time. So now as adults, we have the huge NSA spying on us all the time. So now, there aren't too many people that are complaining about that because they're used to it.
Well, also to bow down to authority. Ever since you're a little kid, you get thrown in a classroom. You do what we say. You sit still. You be quiet. You listen to what you do. You're constantly being programmed to respond to whatever authority tells you. That's right.
That's right. And I mean, it's one thing to do what somebody says because it makes sense to you, but nobody has authority to override your integrity. So I see a lot of people violating their own integrity to follow rules that don't make sense. And that comes from the programming that we got as children. But they're afraid to defy authority, so they'll go ahead and give up. They'll do something that is against their better judgment just to follow the rules,
against their freedom and integrity.
Yeah That's what
that's right, everybody. We've been going for nearly 2 hours, and I think we've covered pretty much everything now that I think we can possibly say in a fairly short time. I think, George, your revelations tonight have helped a lot of people. Absolutely brilliant. Jerry, you gave a fantastic introduction as usual and framed the whole subject. Sherri, you've added to it with the solution, and that has been reinforced by you three tonight with what you've said individually and together. It's been absolutely fantastic. So that's great. I'd like to thank you all for being on. Do join us on Sunday, 9:30 p.m. UK time for Windows on the World at windowsontheworld.net. And you can find everything. All our shows are all available on windowsontheworld.net. We are actually uploading to different video channels, trying to find the best ones. We do use BitChute now and again. I will be using it a bit more after finding out that brand new Tube was pretty useless. Well, it's useless at the moment as far as we're concerned. But that's about it for tonight. So thanks to everyone who's been in chat. I've been very fascinated, as usual, by what's going on in there, and at times highly amused, and I've been joining in myself. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Jerry, Sherri, and George. And Jerry, I was asked by someone in chat if you could hold your book up again and give the title and where we can get it, just to finish the show off.
Okay. Well, you're breaking up real bad at this end, but yeah, thank you for having us.
He wants you to hold up the book and tell people where they can get it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's right.
You never break up. George was breaking up. Okay, here it is.
And what's it called, Jerry? Give us the title, because I've read it and other people want to read it as well.
Yeah, it's called An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower. So you can get it at jerrymarzinski.com under the book section. And while you're there, watch some of the videotapes. Sherri and I have done a lot of videos, and George is starting to do them, talking about this stuff and the experiences we've had with these things. But these things are absolutely real. They appear in everybody's head. Every time you get a negative thought, like Sherri says, about self or others, that's them inserting that in there. And they're constantly trying to generate negative emotional energy, and then they feed off of your energy. And I don't know how they get it out, but I've had prisoner after prisoner tell me they could just feel their energy leaving when these things were attacking. So they hit us all. It's like a normal curve. I mean, the schizophrenics are at one end, but it bleeds into the rest of the population all the way over to the other side. It's a human experience, and psychiatry is throwing people off the oh yeah, it's a biological thing. It is not a biological thing. It is not a chemical thing. They have no proof for it. They have no evidence for it, and a lot of research proving it is not. But in order to keep their income stream going, they keep publishing this lie. Oh, it may be a chemical imbalance, or it may be or it is, and they, like I said, they can't fathom a illness that has no physical cause or a physical cure. So they keep dumping toxic meds on top of it. So be aware.
Thanks, Jerry. If you can just give us your website, Jerry, and any other information from Sherri, where we can find what Sherri's doing.
Yeah, my website is keyholejourney.com. I have a lot of Jerry's information on there as well, but since we developed his website of jerrymarzinski.com, all of his information from my website has been moved over to his website, but I've left a copy of what I already had. So, but my website covers an awful lot more topics, so feel free to go there. There's a link to the book on that website as well. So, and there's links to my YouTube, my BitChute, and my LBRY account.
Wow, it's pretty comprehensive, Sherri. And it's jerrymarzinski.com for Jerry. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't hear you. You're breaking up. But,
yeah, that's correct, Mark. jerrymarzinski.com, and my website is keyholejourney.com.
That's great. George, have you got anything that you'd like to bring to our attention, or are you just experiencing things at the moment?
If anybody is currently hearing voices, wants to talk about hearing voices or ways that they can help maintain their sense of self within their own experience of hearing voices, contact me on Facebook, George Jagatic, Jagatic. Friend me on Facebook, and I'd be happy to reach out to you and share my own experience with you in this arena.
That's great, George. Thanks a lot, everyone. It's been really interesting tonight, as usual. We will be doing more live streams. The days might vary. We were going to do this last night. Was a little bit tired. And I actually was going to be talking to a great friend of mine, Erkan, who's made it all the way to Turkey by road because there's no way out of the UK by air unless you go to another country. That's another story, something we'll be exploring in the weeks to come. But there's always a means of escape for anyone who wants to get out of the UK. And for anyone who doesn't, well, good luck. We'll see you on Sunday. Thanks a lot, everyone, and good night.
Good night. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Good night.
Thank you, Mark.